I hope you watched part 1 of this, Yahweh as Divine Warrior in the Old Testament, but I realize not everyone will have. So a minimal previously on will serve as an introduction for some and a refresher for others. So the chaos comp motif was the ancient author's way of exalting their god as the king of the gods. He does battle against the forces of chaos, the primary foe, symbolized as a sea dragon. Think of Leviathan, things like that. There were 4 elements common to the story that we focused on. 1, weather phenomena, lightning, thunder, wind, etc. But especially of note was how thunder was the mighty voice of God, his rebuke, which made his enemies flee or submit. 2nd, binding or muzzling the defeated foe was common. 3rd, trampling, treading, walking, or standing on the defeated enemy. And last, commonly there was the dividing or dismembering of the dragon and then scattering its body. And so we observed many of these elements through Scripture in part 1, but also very relevant for the transition here into the New Testament and especially Mark's introduction. We talked about the sacred road idea, partially based on comparative ancient Near Eastern festivals, also the internal evidence of Scripture. Many commentators believe the New Year festival, the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, was a time when the Ark of the Covenant was temporarily removed from its place in the temple to a sacred shrine outside of the temple as the sacred space was purified. It was then taken in a procession back into the temple and reinstalled. This, it's argued, is the basis for some of the ascension language, Allah, to go up, going up to Jerusalem, things like that. And so there was this specific road the procession took, and this procession was where certain of these enthronement psalms were sung or recited. This is all about enthronement. Yahweh is being recognized as God of gods because he defeated chaos and established order, and the new year was the remembrance of that. And there's so much more we could do. Remember, we skipped over the intertestamental period, the Second Temple literature, but we'll hit a few key passages here and there, and we're also going to skip over the rest of the New Testament in general and follow Dempsey, who is tracking through Mark. But even Paul, for example, remember, he mentions the death of death, and he mentions Jesus trampling the enemy, and of course, Revelation. Entire books and dissertations cover the connections with the combat motif in John's Apocalypse. But the goal here is to cover a few episodes through Mark, and I'll timestamp this stuff as usual. And up first, the introduction, and then John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. The opening verses of Mark read, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, Prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." Now, straight away, there's a number of things worth pointing out. The first of which we'll note here, this language of the beginning. Dempsey points out it has this inaugurated eschatology feel here. So in the book of Revelation, we saw the earthly ministry and sacrificial death of Jesus beginning, but not concluding the apocalyptic conflict. It is by the blood of the Lamb that the dragon is fought and cast down from heaven. But once cast down, his power actually increases over the earth. It is not until the second coming of Jesus that the dragon is ultimately vanquished. In Revelation, then, Jesus' earthly ministry does parallel a spiritual battle with the dragon. Such is the beginning of the good news. The conclusion is the end itself. And so you'll often read this in commentaries and things like that, the already but not yet concept of the kingdom of God. The kingdom is here. The Lord reigns. But there's this fuller sense that still awaits fulfillment. And so what Mark is tracking on is the beginning of the gospel. Now, gospel here is itself very interesting, and we discussed this a little bit last time. And so Mark is tracking on Isaiah 40 verse 3 here in his introduction. A voice cries in the wilderness, so on and so forth. But verse 9 is what we want to look at here. It's so go on up a high mountain And there we are with some of this ascension language. O Zion, herald of good news. And then it's going to repeat again this herald of good news language. And it's this BSR root. But this Beser terminology in the Old Testament, it's not good news generically. As Dempsey pointed out, it's an almost technical term for the good news from the battlefield. It's often connected with the sons of the priest who bore the ark, and it was the news of the enemy king's defeat. So this is very pregnant language to start a gospel with. Now, because of the New Testament and later Christianity, gospel kind of gets truncated into all sorts of things. But the point is the Old Testament context, that this terminology, this BSR terminology, is routinely going to get translated in the Greek. Obviously, it's the same gospel terminology, euangelizomai, which I know I butchered, but who cares? But the point is, it's the same terminology. It's connected to holy warfare, basically. And so that is what Jesus is engaged in here. As one commentator put it, it's a battle chronicle. Now, Mark is tracking on Isaiah 40 as well as Micah 3, specifically verses 1 and 2. So, as I point out here, Mark's introduction is a composite of Isaiah 43 through 5 and Malachi 3, 1 and 2. Both of these passages have the same imagery, the New Year festival procession via the sacred road up to the temple. Though in Mark, instead of the Epiphany via the ark, it's the Son. So instead of seeing the Ark of the Covenant, and that's the representation of God, they're going to get the incarnation. And this is what John the Baptist is doing. He's the herald. He's the guy in front of the procession, clearing the road, proclaiming the good news, proclaiming victory from the battlefield. And so it has this heavy New Year festival resonance. And so John appears on the scene, baptizing in the wilderness. And this can literally be desert. And we're going to note this further down the line. Down to verse 7, John is speaking of someone mightier, in that John baptizes in water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. Now, down to verse 9, we get into the baptism of Jesus. And once again, just a whole lot of stuff going on here. So first of note is that John is baptizing in the Jordan, which itself has a lot of Old Testament resonances here. So first off, we'll point out this is in Hans Chronicles commentary, 1 Chronicles 12 specifically, that the Gadites also pass over the Jordan at the time of the year when the Jordan was overflowing in all its banks. So there's this connection between 1 Chronicles 12, the Gadites defecting over to David, and it's connecting it to Joshua 3:11-4:1. Now Dempsey, speaking of this, says Mark depicts Jesus in terms of the Ark of the Covenant on the processional way to Jerusalem for enthronement. Granting this, one may see Mark setting up such an interpretation with Jesus passing through the Jordan, i.e. his baptism. Of course, Yahweh, in the form of his ark, passed through the Jordan on the way into Canaan. This passage inaugurated the conquest. So does Jesus' baptism in the Jordan inaugurate the final eschatological conquest, that of Satan's forces over the world. Even those crossings of the Gadites in Chronicles, Joshua, into the Promised Land themselves were a bit of a look back to the crossing of the Red Sea when Pharaoh and his hosts were defeated. And so Jesus being baptized in the Jordan should evoke all of these images, the images of conquest. And then moving to verse 10, and when he came up out of the water, immediately he saw the heavens being torn open, and the Spirit descending on him like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, with you I am well pleased." A lot of interesting things going on here. So this came up language, Allah type language of going up. Well, in the Greek, this ascent language is what Jesus is doing out of the water. So his ascending, his going up out of the water. Again, this is processional ark language. Here I have a quotation from Cyril of Jerusalem, whose dates are 313 to 386. So this is a pretty early Christian. And he's tracking on these kinds of themes. He says, "Now since the heads of the dragon must be broken, Jesus, having gone down into the waters, bound the strong ones so that we should have the power to walk on scorpions and snakes." So notice he has the binding and trampling motifs here and is connecting this to baptism. And so this is a pretty ancient interpretation of Jesus' baptism. In commenting on this language of the heavens being torn open, I'm not going to go deep into the testament of the patriarchs, partially because it's not really known when the dates of this were. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, although it should be noted here in verse 12, you have Beliar, which is another Satan name, shall be bound by him, and he shall give power to his children to tread upon evil spirits. There you have exactly the binding and trampling motifs again connected, but here, this is the one that people generally tend to focus on, is starting at 6, the heavens shall be opened, and from the temple of glory shall come upon him sanctification, with the Father's voice as from Abraham to Isaac. And that's important because this is not generically Father and Son. This is specifically the only Son, only begotten Son, the beloved Son, this kind of language, which is exactly what you get here in verse 11. This is my beloved Son. And then the glory of the Most High shall be uttered over him, and the spirit of understanding and sanctification shall rest upon him in the water. This is in brackets because commentators and scholars wonder if this was a later Christian interpolation. Either way, Dempsey also points out that this follows Daniel 7 pretty nicely as well. And so he writes that Jesus shows his power at the Jordan, goes up from the waters, is met by sanctification from the heavenly temple via the dove, and receives kingship from Yahweh. So we have 1, miracle at the river, 2, ascent towards the temple, 3, conference of kingship enthronement. The progression is that of the combat myth. And I go ahead and add in this discussion on the dove, even though it's not super relevant to our discussion today, but Joel Marcus sums up what's probably the best guess at what's going on here, that the most plausible theory is that the dove is meant to echo Genesis 1:2, where the Spirit soars bird-like over the waters. Now, of course, remember, these are the waters of chaos, and the Spirit is hovering over these waters. Of course, this language is kind of picked up in Deuteronomy 32, this hovering language. That still kind of leaves open the question of why a dove specifically. Now, it should be noted, there was another scholar I read who was tying this to more of like a Greco-Roman context, that you often have the gods appearing in birds. And so to a more Greco-Roman reader, they would immediately recognize here that this is a God-man. This is deity. So that could be part of it. But again, I still think the dove is kind of interesting. So you may be wondering what's going on up here with the numbers. This is Alpha. This is Omega. Numerically, it's 801. And then you see this word here is 801. You have the math breakdown. So what is that word specifically? Well, it's the word for dove. And so it's possible that the bird language is chosen because of the Genesis 1-2 chaos waters creation language. This is a new creation, a new taming of chaos, and that makes sense. But why specifically the dove? Well, it could be related to Noah, the concept of rest. Of course, that connects you to the flood, but it's also possible, if gematria is going on here, that this is signaling that this is the Alpha and Omega, which Jesus directly identifies himself as in Revelation. So potentially some of that as well. And then you have the voice come from heaven in verse 11. This is my beloved Son, or you are my beloved Son, which echoes to Psalm 2, which itself connects to the other Davidic messianic monarchy psalms like Psalm 89, Psalm 74. Of course, those have heavy chaos conf themes, which we saw last time. So this entire introduction to baptism is just full of Messiah as divine warrior motifs. So his in the Jordan being identified as the Alpha and Omega, the Son of God. Of course, the Jordan was connected to David, monarchy, Joshua, which is Jesus' name, all the way back to Moses. So he's the greater Moses, the greater Joshua, the greater David. These are all New Testament themes. And it's being set up here in 2 verses in Mark's gospel. Now, immediately after this, as Mark says, he likes to use that term immediately, Jesus is drove into the wilderness. And this wilderness language, again, it's going to come up later, and it can very well be translated as desert. So the Spirit led him out, drove him out into the wilderness, the desert, and he was in the desert for 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. So once again, two verses that are very densely packed here. If you're familiar with Heiser's stuff, you probably well know this, but here we'll look at Dempsey, who points out that Ernest Best observes that, according to Jewish demonology, the desert is among other places which demons are specifically supposed to inhabit. We have also seen how, and of course we passed over this material, but in the apocalyptic reflex of the combat myths scattering motif, the desert becomes the prison abode for the temporarily defeated chaos rebel. That is, Jesus is powerfully compelled into the desert, as his very first act suggests a divine warrior keen to face the cosmic enemy. With the advent of Jesus' ministry, the time for battle has arrived at last. And in fact, this language of being tempted is going to point out here, that is, Dempsey is going to interact here with man, as well as Joel Marcus. They both point out here that this language, this verb here, tempted, ought to be understood in the sense of to wage war on, the first engagement in the eschatological conflict. Marcus similarly says that the emphasis here is on the hostility between the two combatants. Thus, to Mark's audience, there was no confusion about what was occurring. Jesus was engaged in battle with the cosmic rebel, Satan. And in light of that, we get into this odd phrase about the wild animals, which many commentators kind of stumble over trying to understand what's going on. Dempsey here has some very helpful observations. He says in the Septuagint's Greek translation of Psalm 68, the chaos monsters which Yahweh rebukes are called theria. I know I'm butchering that, but who cares? While it is theria that rise out of the sea in Theodotion's translation of Daniel 7, in Revelation 13, the author uses theria to refer to the beasts which rise out of the sea and land as chaos monsters. This final case is particularly instructive, for here the beasts, theria, are clearly the helpers of the dragon, standing in the subordinate relationship of Leviathan to Yam, or Tiamat's monstrous helpers, to the draconic sea goddess herself. And so this term here isn't just generic, like hyenas or something like that. It's often used, or at least sometimes used, in this kind of mythological sense. And in that vein, the line says that he was with the wild animals, but the term here is meta. And as Dempsey's going to point out, this phrase in meta can actually mean something different here. So he says Jesus is not meta with the beast. He is meta over, after, above them. In his book, The Temptations of Jesus in Early Christianity, Gibson notes that the construction in meta can signify subordination and mastery over something. So Jesus is engaged in this battle with Satan in the desert, but he is over these wild beasts, the chaos monsters' helpers. He's over them, and the angels were ministering to him. And this is out of Longman and Reed, their God is a Warrior book. We should consider the possibility that the angels of Mark 1:13 are not simply emissaries of heavenly hospitality, but in their assistance provide strategic counsel to Jesus, the divine warrior, at a crucial moment of eschatological warfare. And I should note, I've seen, because of the 40-day testing, having an obvious connection to the 40-year desert wandering by the nation of Israel in Exodus, there are those who would connect Jesus' baptism with the crossing of the Red Sea. In other words, the crossing of the Red Sea was the nation's baptism. Though, of course, they repeatedly fell in the desert. Here, the divine warrior, who led the people out of Egypt, by the way, incarnates himself and will not fail. But the Red Sea connection with baptism fits our themes, since the Red Sea event was a chaos comp story. We saw that last time. But here we have our first engagement with the forces of chaos and the dragon, Satan, and Jesus is meta, is over them. And then in verse 14, now after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee proclaiming the gospel of God. Again, he's proclaiming victory from the battlefield and saying, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. Believe in the battle report. And then immediately it switches over into passing alongside the Sea of Galilee. he begins to call his disciples. Now, this is interesting and important because this right here is technically not a sea. Now, this is the word sea, but Luke, Josephus, others refer to this particular body of water as a lake. It's much smaller. It's not an actual ocean. It's not the sea. But Mark uses the term sea consistently. And so commentators think he's doing so deliberately because he wants to evoke the sea imagery of the Old Testament. Again, the divine warrior, chaos Kampf. This is Jesus overcoming the sea. And so even though it's a lake, historically, as far as the narrative goes, Mark wants you to be thinking of the forces of chaos. And so Jesus is passing along the sea. He calls his first disciples, but immediately after this, we have Jesus going into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and is going to have a confrontation here with a man with an unclean spirit in the synagogue. And the spirit asks, "Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they're all amazed by this in verse 28, and at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. Now, believe it or not, this actually also has a number of chaos Kampf motifs going on in it. And really the key here is this phrase, "be silent, come out of him." So as Dempsey points out, the mighty voice rebuke is by no means the extent of traditional chaos Kampf imagery employed by the evangelist here. For having been rebuked by the spirit, Jesus then orders it to be bound in a muzzle. So it's literally be muzzled. With this command, Mark proceeds to make obvious use of the traditional binding motif from the combat myth as well, like Ninurta and the stone things, the storm god and the serpent, Marduk and Tiamat, Yahweh and Leviathan, Raphael and Azazel, and the Messiah and Beliar. So Jesus binds the demon. And I've always found this interesting that in the Old Testament, you have the very human warrior of Joshua, who's actually commissioned by the captain of the Lord's host. But he is tasked with driving out the Canaanites and dispossessing the Canaanites of the land. So the land is possessed by the Canaanites, and it's Joshua's job to drive them out. And specifically, remember, there are these Karem places where they're to put under the ban, where they destroy everything. And those are giant clan populations. But it's interesting because in the New Testament, you have Jesus driving out demons that have possessed the people. And so I think there's an association between the two. And in fact, Dempsey even notes it here, the fact that the Enochic answer for where demons come from is actually giants. So there is a direct connection between the demonic activity and the giants in the Old Testament. So he notes that in Enochic literature, posited that they arose from the slain giants born to the rebellious watcher angels. Most of them were destroyed, but a portion was left on earth to do the work of the devil. That is, to take humans captive in the cosmic battle by possessing them or making them sick. At the end of verse 27, you have the people comment that even the unclean spirits, that they obey him. And Dempsey writes of this, that they obey him is more literally they listen to him. The significance being the divine warrior traditionally achieves victory by means of his voice. In the Old Testament, the forces of chaos are conquered by the voice, thundering. Here it's the rebuke of Jesus that the demonic helpers of the dragon are subdued. Also of note, the term fame is report or news. Dempsey observes that the Septuagint translation of Isaiah 52, 6-7, we find that good news here, or gospel, takes the direct object of news or report. So let's just go ahead and look at it. And so this is the well-known, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news. So again, this is our gospel language, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness. Let's go ahead and look at it in the Greek. And so we have the good news here. And as you can see here, it's the same terminology of what the people do. They go spread the fame, they spread the news. But again, what news are they spreading? The gospel. Yes, it's the gospel. Yes, they're spreading the good news, but they're spreading the battle report. They've seen an engagement of the divine warrior, and they are now sent out as heralds, essentially, proclaiming the victory of their king and the death of the enemy king. Next, we move to chapter 4, and there's going to be a cluster of divine warrior episodes. But before that, we should note Mark 3:27. Jesus says, "But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then indeed he may plunder his house." So a clear binding motif there. And this also connects back to the stronger one that John the Baptist was referring to in the prologue. And it's also reminiscent of Psalm 93 we looked at last time. The waters roar, but mightier than the roaring of many waters is the Lord. But down to Mark 4:35 and following, this episode is one that nearly all the commentators will note the chaos conf motifs. And so they get in these boats, and there's a great windstorm that arises, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat is filling with water. But Jesus is asleep through all of this. And the disciples are trying to wake him up, and they say, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" And when he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him?" Now this rebuke language is our traditional chaos conf weapon of the divine warrior. His rebuke, his thundering. So, and these are the LXX. So Psalm 17:16, "And the fountains of the waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were exposed at your rebuke, O Lord, at the blasting of the breath of your anger." And so as I click on rebuked here, as we're going to note here, it's this same terminology. Psalm 103:6 and 7, "The deep, like a cloak, is his covering. The waters will stand on the mountains. At your rebuke, they will flee. At the voice of your thunder, they will become afraid." And this is actually rather interesting that the waters will stand on the mountains. It will become relevant for our next episode. Psalm 105:9, "And he rebuked the Red Sea, and it was dried up." Job 26:11 and 13, "The pillars of heaven were passive and astonished at his rebuke. He has put down the sea with his might and crippled the sea monster with his skill. The barriers of heaven fear him, and by a command he has slain the rebel dragon." So clearly here Jesus is acting as the divine warrior of old. And this peace, be still language, again, is that be muzzled language. So he rebukes the wind and says to the sea, "Be muzzled." So here, performing two of the four elements that we looked at the beginning. Now, very interesting, because right off of the heels of this, we move on to chapter 5. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. They are met out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. So they're immediately, right after coming off the sea, are met with a man who is possessed living among the tombs. And in verse 4, this man was bound with shackles and chains, but no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day he was among the tombs on the mountains, and he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and that's literally mountainside. It's the same term we got at the beginning. They begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs. And the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. Now we could comment on everything, but we'll just pick a couple of things. Dempsey notes here that Mark's specification of his location on the mountains likely serves his narrative as more than just superfluous detail. As we have seen, one form of the Hebrew chaos comp seems to have echoed elements of the Mesopotamian myth of Ninurta and the Azag demon, where the chief concern after the chaos monster's defeat was the water's accumulation on the mountaintops. Remember, we just saw this in the Psalms. Because of this, Ninurta created an irrigation system and thereby set the proper boundaries for the waters. Likewise, in the traditional Hebrew version, Yahweh subdues the rebellious waters on the mountains with his mighty rebuke, frightening them to flee their proper boundaries. And so this is kind of interesting as well, that the man is living among the tombs. And Dipsy actually notes that in Psalm 68 in the LXX, there's kind of a unique translational thing where you actually get reference to graves. It's a different term though, but of course, Psalm 68 had a ton of the chaos comp stuff going on as well. But maybe the tombs aspect is more to do with the associations with death. And so Dempsey's pointing out here that the demoniac roars in irresistible might. And so he's like the demoniac of Mark 1. And of course, there's this close proximity with the sea in this episode here, heightening the connection with chaos and the traditional unruly waters. Likewise, the demoniac's residence among the tombs, apart from highlighting his uncleanness, may also parallel the chaos enemy's associations with the pit, as the term in Hebrew usage was equated with death and Sheol, and incidentally the miry waters of death. The demoniac's habitation in tombs metaphorically links him with the realm of death. In this way, Mark has taken a symbolic mythic motif and converted it into an historical one, making the cosmic pit the earthly tombs. Finally, about the binding with chains, Mark uses the typical word, dio, again, and he's referring to all of these binding words used in this section. The verb often used for the binding of chaos enemies. So a couple of little verbal links here and there, and this is starting to look, again, like another chaos comp interaction. But I want us to mentally take note of what happens here in this conclusion, that ultimately we have this legion of demons rushing headlong into the sea and drowning. In fact, I write here of the legion aspect because a legion is a technical term for a few thousand Roman soldiers. Some have emphasized the political dimensions to this answer. The Chaos Comp writings do in fact associate their political enemies with the forces of chaos. However, the political dimension is likely not the primary intention of Mark. Dempsey observes, as the puppet master of oppressive nations, Satan's power is the true source of Rome's power, and thus Satan, not Rome, is the ultimate enemy. Rome is a helper beast. Satan is the dragon. And so I would agree, even if there is an anti-Rome polemic in this, it's not the primary intent. After this, we're going to move down to chapter 6, specifically verse 30 and following, the feeding of the 5,000. Now you may be wondering how this has anything to do with the Chaos Comp Divine Warrior motifs, but it surprisingly does. Now we will begin here by noting that Jesus said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." This desolate place language is the wilderness language we saw at the beginning, like Jesus' temptation. And the desert area is associated with demonic entities, things like that. Like think of the Day of Atonement, for example. They send out one of the goats into the wilderness. And if you're familiar with these broader categories, there's these connections with the goat demons and stuff like that. Again, their typical habitation is desert stuff. So you have demonic activity associated with the desert. So that's the first thing that we want to take into account. And I'll go ahead and read this from Heiser's Demons book. And he's quoting out of Enoch 67 through 9. And he's talking about the two monsters, Leviathan in the abyss of the ocean, and the male Behemoth, which holds his chest in an invisible desert, whose name is Dundain, or however you say that. In writing of this, Heiser says, the passage clearly considers Behemoth as the land-desert counterpart of the chaos monster Leviathan. And he points out that this is implicit in Job 40:15 through 41:34 and continues well into the rabbinic literature. Behemoth occupies an invisible desert called Dundain. Nickelsburg and Vanderkam point out these other 4 readings, which indicate a connection with the reading Daudile in 1 Enoch 10:4. This was the pit in the place of jagged rocks, where Azazel, or Satan, was cast and imprisoned. And so there's this association with Behemoth and the desert region, which of course this is where Jesus specifically tells them to go in this episode. Now, this is out of John Day's book, God's Conflict with the Sea Dragon, and is commenting more broadly on the Isaiah apocalypse, specifically chapter 25. And he says, it is wholly in keeping with the view that the eschatological banquet in Judaism had its origin in the banquet following Yahweh's and ultimately Bel's victory over the unruly sea and the chaos monsters. And then he lists these passages, which we're going to look at here, 4th Ezra as well as 2nd Baruch, and he also mentions Enoch in another passage. It is specifically the chaos monsters Leviathan and Behemoth, which are to be devoured at the messianic banquet. We recall, too, the reference to the slaying of Leviathan in Isaiah 27:1. So the 4 Ezra reference, we'll just skip down to the very end, but to Leviathan you have the 7th part, the watery part, and you have kept them to be eaten by whom you wish and when you wish. So we have both of the chaos creatures here mentioned, and they're to be eaten by whoever the Lord wishes. 2nd Baruch, and they, and again, that is Behemoth and Leviathan in context. And of course, this is on the hills of the Anointed One, will begin to be revealed, but they will be nourishment for all who are left. And so hopefully you can already see where this is going. And this isn't just a brand new interpretation. We saw this in Psalm 74, for instance. Leviathan serving as food for creatures in the wilderness. So this is the eschatological version of that. You have the chaos monsters being the dinner served at the banquet of the Lord, the great marriage supper of the Lamb, to use the New Testament apocalyptic language. But that's the future, the not yet. The already version of that eschatological banquet is here in Mark 6. And so we have the desolate place. Okay, so we have the right setting. And then the disciples are going to Jesus saying, send these people home so they can go eat and that kind of thing. And Jesus tells them to feed them, which of course they say, well, we don't have the money to do that. We don't have the means. And so Jesus asks them to go, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And they come back and they said, 5 and 2 fish. And Jesus sits them down in groups. And then in verse 41, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Writing of this, we have Kill here, the apocalyptic significance of Mark's feeding narrative. The fish was associated with Leviathan, God's primordial adversary. At the very least, one can observe a trajectory that extends from the Old Testament reflections on chaos, Leviathan, and primordial waters, to the idea of the mythical beast being food for the righteous, as seen in 2nd Baruch, 4 Ezra, 1 Enoch, Tobit. By the 1st century, this trajectory found expression in the apocalyptic tradition, in which fish represented both threat and opportunity. The great fish monster Leviathan tried to assert chaos, but in the end is thwarted, with the righteous tasting the victory. And Dempsey writes of this, with the apocalyptic significance of the miracle clear enough, we see that Mark narrates the event as an instance of Jesus dividing and scattering the fish. Verse 41 reads, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. In fact, Jesus' actions here are so similar to Psalm 74, Mark may be alluding to that text as the very script for this event. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the creatures in the wilderness. And I think we're onto something, because immediately after this, as Mark tells us, immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. Now, the end of this episode is going to loop back and connect to the feeding episode. So these 2 miracles are informing each other. And so Jesus sends them on the boat in the water, and he goes up to a mountain to pray. And then he's going to see them, that they're struggling because the wind was against them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I," or literally, "I am. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. And commenting on this, Dempsey says, Hell and others have persuasively argued that fundamentally the sea walking miracle functions as an epiphany, that is, an appearance of God. This accounts for why Jesus wished to pass by them, since in the theophanies to Moses and Elijah, Yahweh is said to pass by before them. And at the transfiguration, we're going to run into these 2 figures again. Also common are the assurances against being afraid, and certainly the expression of the divine name hinted at with Jesus' proclamation, "I am I, ego eimi." The sea walking miracle works essentially then as an epiphany story, the one in which the disciples failed to recognize his true identity. This is particularly notable, as we have seen that the procession and enthronement of Yahweh at the Feast of Tabernacles acted as the chief ritual epiphany in Israel's cult. The transfer of Yahweh's ark was the time when all Israel saw Yahweh, no longer hidden within the Holy of Holies, but moving in procession to the celebration of thronging spectators. Indeed, the image of Yahweh would then literally be seen to pass by his people as the ark made its way to its sacred destinations. This was the day of the Lord, which later writers interpreted as the eschatological day of God's judgment over the earth. So Jesus appears to his disciples in epiphanic glory in the same context of victory over the chaos forces. Because remember, Feast of Tabernacles, the New Year Day procession, this was tied to the remembrance of the victory over chaos. So it certainly makes a lot of sense in this context. But remember, I said, going all the way back to the calming of the sea, that we saw that mastery over the sea, and then immediately after that, we had an interaction with a legion of demons who were drowned in the sea, and then a miraculous feeding. All of this so far mirrors Exodus, the crossing of the sea, the Egyptian armies drowning in the heart of the sea, immediately followed by manna, the miraculous feeding in the desert wilderness. But later in Exodus 33 specifically, Moses asks to see God's glory, and the Lord passes by him and reveals the divine name Yahweh. And this is what we get in Mark 6, the passing by and the revelation that Jesus is ego eimi, I am Yahweh. In the conclusion of the narrative connects the water walk with the feeding. Both of these things are meant to signal the same thing. I think on one level, the Exodus, the Lord is repeating the same mighty acts of old. But also on another level, these aren't generic acts. These are ancient deeds of the divine warrior. But the people miss it because their hearts were hardened, of course, which has Exodus themes as well. But I like this summary by Dempsey. He says, this theme of misunderstanding Jesus' identity as the victorious divine warrior is pervasive in Mark. The irony of the gospel is that after being urged for centuries to take action and fight the forces of chaos, God is finally doing so, but no one recognizes it. And it should also be noted within the same context that I can't remember his first name, but there was a scholar, Combs, who argued that in the more broader Greco-Roman context, that they would have understood the water walk as an epiphany, as an appearance of a god. And he goes through the literature and points out, though, that the one thing you would not conclude is that he's a ghost, because ghosts don't walk on water, but deities do. And so you have the disciples concluding the one thing they shouldn't conclude. So a reader would be astonished at how dense the disciples are coming across here when they conclude the one thing they should not be concluding. And the next passage that we'll look at is in chapter 9, the transfiguration. Now, this doesn't have necessarily combat motifs per se, but it does have tabernacles motifs going on. And so for that reason, it's relevant to the study. And so Jesus and his inner circle of Peter, James, and John go up on a high mountain by themselves. And specifically, literally, they're led, that's important language. That's part of that ascension type language. And they go up to a high mountain, which is probably Mount Hermon. Again, if you saw part 1, located in the region of Bashan, an important location where the Watchers are said to have descended in Enoch. And we get, and he, Jesus, was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter is going to suggest that they make 3 tents, booths, for each of them. Even though this is kind of adjacent to what we're talking about, I want to pick this out by Orlov, because you'll often get this with the anti-Trinitarians who will really try to play up this like second Moses kind of idea to downplay the divinity aspects of Jesus. And of course, up to this point, if Jesus is the divine warrior, he's the divine warrior. So it's kind of like it sidesteps that whole discussion. But here, Orlov is interacting with the fact that you kind of get this with Moses on some level. He says, in the biblical accounts, Moses' face becomes luminous only after the prophet's encounter with God. The appearance of God's form thus precedes the transformation of the seer's face, which in these theophanic currents is often understood as a mere mirror of the divine glory. However, in the transfiguration story, Jesus' luminous metamorphosis occurs before the apparition of the divinity. This manifests a striking contrast to the biblical Exodus theophanies, or even their parabiblical counterparts, like the exegogy, where the initial source of Moses' glorious face, or his glorious apotheosis, the divine form, appears first. Jesus himself thus became understood as a revelation of the divine glory and not as its glorious mirror. So the point is, Moses has to first encounter God before he serves as this mirror. His face becomes illuminated. And he's referencing here the exegogy, which is Ezekiel, the tragedy end. It was a BC era play. And for that reason alone, it's actually noteworthy. But you get this 2 powers in heaven kind of thing going on, where Moses is kind of like Enoch or Metatron, if you're familiar with that kind of material. So he kind of gets elevated into that second power status. But what Orlov is pointing out here is that there's a similarity with Moses going up on the mountain, and of course his eventual apotheosis kind of idea. But with Jesus, it's different. It's his own glory. It's a revelation of his glory that he shares with the Father, basically. It's not just a mirror of God's glory. And in fact, Dempsey is going to interact with some of this as well. So he writes that Peter himself understands the scene within the typology of the Feast of Tabernacles, and so suggests constructing booths in which to stay. Moreover, the presence of Moses and Elijah play into the enthronement motif. As we have seen, Elijah was named by the prophet Malachi as the herald of the eschatological enthronement procession. Mark himself quotes this prophecy in his epigraph. To meet Elijah then on the way to Jerusalem, in the very eschatological enthronement procession he was prophesied to herald, gives a clear indication of what is happening. That's really interesting, because from here on out, Jesus is making a beeline to Jerusalem to, quote unquote, to be enthroned, but it's to be crucified, to go and die. And so that's his enthronement. But we talked about in part one of this, that messy law idea, that sacred road idea. He's now taking that sacred road to Jerusalem for enthronement. And so the connection with Elijah connects to Malachi, connects to the sacred road idea, connects to the New Year festival, the divine warrior, all of that stuff. And then he says, as for Moses, he points out that Joel Marcus is noting here basically what we saw with Orlov, including the 2nd century BC stuff, that Moses was understood to have been enthroned by God and even shared in God's kingship. Again, the two powers kind of stuff that you see sometimes associated with Moses. And also worth pointing out, though, with these two is that Heiser, I forget if it might be in the Jude series that Heiser did, but he actually mentions this scene because specifically in the case of Moses, there's that question of his body and where it was buried and the dispute over the body of Moses and things like that. So he actually talks about it and ties it into this episode. So that could also be lurking underneath this as well. There's just a number of reasons why those two would seemingly appear. It should be noted in places like Mark 10, verse 2, that the Pharisees come up in order to test him. And that testing language is that same language of the temptation or the testing in the wilderness by Satan. And we saw there it was a conflict with Satan, with the dragon. And so they were doing battle. And so when you have these people come up and testing Jesus with these questions, they're playing the part of the helpers of the dragon. And so we should understand these interactions in that kind of way. And also worth commenting on is in Mark 10:35 and following. This is when James and John ask to be granted the position of the right hand and left hand of Jesus when he's enthroned. And Jesus tells them, you don't know what you're asking. And he says, are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized? And so, of course, we know from the narrative that when Jesus is finally recognized as the King of the Jews, truly this was the Son of God, stuff like that. It's at the crucifixion. That's his enthronement. And that's what's so dramatic about this whole inversion of the divine warrior. But they're asking to be by his side and is saying, you don't know what you're asking for yet. Who is enthroned by his side? Who's worthy in that moment are a thief and a murderer. But here, once again, they don't understand the full mission of the divine warrior. And worth commenting on is this language, the baptism language. Dempsey writes that Perkins makes the connection here between Jesus' baptism of suffering with the chaos waters, noting Old Testament references to water overwhelming the sufferer in lament psalms may have provided the origin of this metaphor. Psalms 42:8, 69:3. Indeed, Psalm 42 contrasts the overwhelming chaos waters with the joy of the Feast of Booths. These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I went with the throng and led them in procession to the house of God, with glad shouts and songs of thanksgiving, a multitude keeping festival. Yet, deep calls to deep at the thunder of your cataracts. All your waves and your billows have gone over me. Psalm 69 also recalls the mythological background of the overwhelming waters. Do not let the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me, or the pit close its mouth over me. That Mark had this verse in mind when writing of the crucifixion is evidenced by Mark 15:36, where the soldiers offer Jesus sour wine, an allusion to Psalm 69:21. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. If we take Perkins' suggestion seriously, which we should, we see that Mark is making yet another connection between Jesus' battle with death on the cross and the chaos tradition. His death is baptism in the overwhelming chaos waters. And now we get to the triumphal entry. And we should note straight away that the Mount of Olives to the east, this actually connects over with Ezekiel as well. This is where the glory departed in that direction. And so Jesus' return is the return of the glory to the temple. Now, concerning though the Mount of Olives in general, Dempsey writes, to appreciate the implications of this seemingly minor detail, one must know what Mark and his audience would have known, The sacred way of the New Year festival led from the Mount of Olives down into the Kidron Valley and then up to the Temple Mount, entering the temple complex through the East Gate. While biblical sources do not state this route explicitly, considerable evidence corroborates it. As we have seen, there would have been a fixed processional path in ancient Jerusalem by which Yahweh's Ark traveled to the temple during festive processions. This was the Mesilah, the paved road that ascends, and some scholars have conjectured about this route. Michael Golder has argued that just as 2 Samuel 6 is often incorrectly understood to echo an annual procession of the Ark to the Jerusalem temple, so the account of David's ascent of the Mount of Olives in 2 Samuel 15 should be understood as the pattern of an annual morning procession. In 2 Samuel 15, David leads a fleeing group out of the city of Jerusalem and up the Mount of Olives during Absalom's insurrection, an event which, according to Moore, would have occurred at the New Year. I'm not sure why he's making that connection, but we did see in the Chronicles study that Joash was installed during a coup on New Year's Day, so that would make sense. But continuing with Dempsey, indeed, following David comes the ark, taken from the city by the high priest Abiathar and Zadok, and carried up the mountain. Once there, David orders its return to the city, saying that he shall see it again if found worthy by Yahweh. The priests obey, and the ark is returned. Chapter 15 supplies us with additional evidence that this suburban cult shrine was in fact on the Mount of Olives, as verse 32 says that after his ascent up Olivet, David came to the summit where God was worshipped. This is supposedly the first mention in the Hebrew Bible of a place on Olivet devoted to the worship of Yahweh. However, if this refers to the house of Obed-edom, the place where the ark would have been kept every year for some period and thus constituted a significant place of worship, this is simply another reference to that cultic site. And we'll actually loop back to some of these details here in a moment. But the triumphal entry is pretty well known, so I'm going to skip through and really only hit a couple things. First off, the fact that this obviously is fulfilling Zechariah 9. Of course, 9 through 14 have a lot of this messianic stuff, but specifically tabernacles type language. We looked at that last time. And specifically here, as Dempsey points out, the connection with Jesus' entry and the New Year Harvest Festival becomes virtually explicit with the mention of leafy branches in 11:8. As Mark's Jewish or even God-fearing audience would have been well aware, Leviticus 23 commanded how the Festival of Tabernacles should be celebrated, declaring, and here he lists the passage, but we have branches of palm trees, leafy trees, you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. So in Mark, while some herald Jesus' enthronement by laying down their cloaks, others cut leafy branches from the fields and sing hymns. This is precisely how the ancient Israelites would have celebrated the coming of Yahweh's Ark along the processional way, and even in the first century would have been an obvious allusion to the celebration of tabernacles. And of course, remember, the people here are shouting Hosanna, and this comes out of Psalm 118, which we looked at last time. We had the language of the gates of righteousness, about entering the gates. So it had these connections to the procession to begin with. And so it seems surely that these are in view in these passages. And then we have the language that some go before and some follow. That's often said of the Ark of the Covenant in these processions. But I want to skip to the end of this narrative here, that he entered Jerusalem, went into the temple, and when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. And so Collins writes of this that this verse is anticlimactic because the honor paid to Jesus in the preceding verses leads the audience to expect his installation as king. Mark frustrates this expectation for several interrelated reasons. Mark portrays his kingship ironically in chapters 11 through 15. Second, Mark redefines the role of Messiah. When Peter identifies Jesus as the Messiah in 8:29, Jesus explains that Messiahship involves suffering, death, and resurrection. Jesus cannot be enthroned as a king in the usual sense during his earthly lifetime because of this destiny of suffering and death. Now, moving down to Dempsey, he thinks that the reason why Jesus leaves ultimately has to do with this typology, with the temple and the ark and all of that. He answers the why, that the temple and the city had not been purified yet. Traditionally, this required the presence of Yahweh to leave the temple and rest on the Mount of Olives. This is precisely what happens in Mark. Jesus, still serving in his role as Yahweh's embodied presence, i.e. the ark, leaves the temple and heads to Bethany, a village on the Mount of Olives. Joel Marcus considers this etymology of this place name, writing here in Nehemiah, you get Ananiah. Ultimately, you get the place, the house of Ananiah. That's what Bethany means. And he's going to point out that it's connected in the sense that it's listed immediately after Nob, which we have seen earlier in the book, may have been the location of the cultic site on the Mount of Olives that was identified with the house of Obed-edom. So here he's connecting all those things back together. And so he's suggesting that Jesus staying at the house of Ananiah, just as the ark stayed in the house of Obed-edom, that we have this kind of typological connection, but it actually goes a little bit deeper than that as well. In fact, with these details in mind, it's interesting because in chapter 14, Jesus is anointed at Bethany. Again, perhaps this house of Obed-edom type location. And so Dempsey writes of this. He says, as set up to this final assumption of kingship, Mark narrates the anointing of Jesus at Bethany, an event permitting multiple interpretations. The one explicitly offered by Jesus is that she has anointed my body beforehand for its burial, thus foreshadowing his crucifixion. However, given that Jesus' crucifixion is also his enthronement, one is permitted another reading. She is anointing Jesus as king. So death and royal glory are again equated. And then here's where he speculates. He's pointing out again Bethany, the house of Ananiah, this being the same thing, and that these are on Olivet, which there's good reason to believe is associated with Obed-edom, the same general location. And he says, if Mark is indeed aware of this tradition, his explicit setting of the anointing in the house of Simon the leper would be a telling emphasis. Now, he's going to launch into part of this discussion that we actually didn't look at. So let's look at this really quickly while we can. So in 1 Kings, it's the very beginning, because this is when Adonijah attempts to usurp the throne. I'll try my best to summarize because we haven't set up these arguments. So I'll give a skeletal, minimalist conclusion. And maybe the entire chain of this isn't there. Maybe only some of these pieces are present. But either way, I think this is interesting. So Bethany in the Mount of Olives region was argued to be the house of Ananiah, and perhaps even connected with the house of Obed-edom, the original keeper of the Ark of the Covenant. And so the suggestion was this house became the temporary shrine that the Ark began its journey back into the temple. So Jesus may be spending the night at this location to return back to Jerusalem. But in addition to that, you have the detail that he was anointed there. And so what is going to note here is that in 1 Kings 9, Adonijah sacrificed sheep, oxen, and fattened cattle by the serpent's stone, which is beside en-rogel. And he invited all of his brothers, etc., etc. Now, the serpent stone is kind of obvious. I mean, that's pretty explicit. But en-rogel as well would translate to something like walking spring or to tread. And so Dempsey offers spring of the trampler. And in fact, this location is referred to in Nehemiah as the dragon spring. And I always thought that this location was odd, the serpent stone. But it makes total sense in light of the monarchy, because if this is the serpent stone and the trampler spring or the dragon's spring, it's evoking divine warrior motifs. And that might actually be why Adonijah is doing this where he is. And in fact, this is probably New Year's Day when this is happening, because of enthronement happening on New Year's Day. That's when the mysterious numbers of the Hebrew kings, this is when they anointed new kings. And so he may have done this intentionally to be anointed here and then led back in the procession as the new king. But you have heavy divine warrior language associated with these locations, specifically the serpent stone idea. But here's how all this connects. As many commentators have noted, that In comparative religion, you had these standing stones that were anointed as part of their processions. In the Hittite case, specifically during the New Year. And I think it was Tidwell that specifically suggested that en-rogel might have been the original beginning point of the procession before it was eventually moved, presumably to the house of Obed-edom, when the temple itself was moved into a more northern site. But anyway, the point is, there were these standing stones associated with the procession where they would begin from. In fact, I think it's 2 Samuel 6, where the Philistines give back the Ark of the Covenant, and they leave the Ark there with sacrifices at a standing stone location. And so all of this makes sense. Now, what Dempsey is arguing or suggesting, or again, he's very honest that it's deep speculation, but if this matrix of ideas is in the minds of the ancients, perhaps Jesus being anointed at this location, again, potentially associated with the house of Obed-edom, where the procession used to begin, maybe that's part of why he's being anointed. He's being anointed to begin the procession back into Jerusalem, to be enthroned. Of course, we know what his enthronement looks like. Now, again, for the sake of time, we're going to speed all the way down to chapter 15, just before the crucifixion, where Jesus is mocked. They give him the crown of thorns, and they salute him, Hail, King of the Jews. And Dempsey says, so the Roman soldiers, in mocking Jesus, ironically declare what the reader, but no one else in Mark's gospel, already knows. He is the king. The mocking salute to Jesus, Hail, King of the Jews, is Mark's functional equivalent of Jesus has become king in the traditional sense as pronounced in the enthronement psalms. And then we get down to the crucifixion in verse 22, and they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And Dempsey is going to note here the language of brought. He says that some commentators have noted the peculiar usage of the Greek verb here, usually translated into English as brought. While the word itself can be translated variously depending on context, its most basic sense is to bear or carry a load. So Collins notes that scholars such as Campbell and Schmidt have, each for their own purposes, respectively, translated the verb more literally as to carry or to bear. And he says that Schmidt suggests the bearing of Jesus recalls how Roman military leaders were borne into triumphal processions. Perhaps, however, Mark is echoing a different kind of triumphal procession, the bearing of Yahweh's ark to his temple for enthronement. And on some level, it could be both, because if he's the military divine warrior, that would make sense. But of course, he's also the presence of God in the sense of the ark. We see the same theme at work in Jesus' entry procession, but the idea is more subtle here since it hinges on elusive syntax. So we find that the transfer of the ark to the temple is twice described in the Hebrew Bible in quite similar terms. And we already noted in verses 26 and 27, when Jesus is officially enthroned, that he's crucified between two robbers, which of course could have been the two brothers, but James and John fled at the arrest of Jesus. And then down to verse 33, and when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And Dempsey is interacting with Rudman in his article, The Crucifixion as Chaos Kampf, a new reading of the Passion narrative in the Synoptic Gospels. Rudman clearly asserts that the crucifixion is expressed literarily as a chaos kampf, but one in which the powers of chaos are victorious. To argue this thesis, he points to 1, the spread of darkness at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, 2, the motif of the Creator's death, and 3, the tearing of the temple curtain. And Dempsey notes a number of passages in Job that connect this theme of darkness associated with death and chaos and things like that. But continuing with Dempsey, he says, darkness is thus associated with death, but with chaos more generally. Mark's statement in 1533 that the darkness came over the whole earth may echo Genesis 1:2, which says that at creation, The earth was formless and uncrafted, and darkness covered the deep. Rudman misses this connection in his analysis, but such an allusion would be entirely fitting. With Jesus' defeat on the cross, the earth has been plunged back into the state of chaos that characterized it before creation. Indeed, this regression into chaos was fundamental to the ancient Near Eastern conception of the New Year. This was the very reason why the victory of the storm god was celebrated at the New Year festival, since his victory meant that fertility in life would return after chaos's defeat. Every year, the world regressed into chaos, and every year at the New Year festival, Yahweh's enthronement signaled the defeat of death and the return of life. So here, before Jesus' life returns at his resurrection, the world is in the trough of death. Chaos has assumed its temporary dominance over the cosmos. And commenting on the "why have you forsaken me" language, Dempsey notes it's long been recognized that it's alluding to Psalm 22, but he writes that no commentators have investigated its links with enthronement and the significance this might play in Mark's crucifixion enthronement paradigm. And then he points out the clear connections, the casting of lots, the mocking, in that the last words of Jesus are the first words of this psalm. And yet, for all this, overlooked are the psalm's words immediately following this cry, which refer to Yahweh enthroned. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you did not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted, they trusted, and you delivered them. Through the speaker of the psalm, and now Jesus himself, cries out in desperation and abandonment. The following verse rings through with a vision of hope, an adversative realization of Yahweh's power in the face of life's suffering. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Jesus appears to be abandoned in his crucifixion, but surely an audience conversant in the Psalms could not help but hear this hopeful answer echoing in their heads as a psalmist's plight. It is as though salvation itself were transposed upon this scene of despair, victory beaming simultaneous with defeat. In short, a masterful stroke for an author keen to show glory in suffering and a divine warrior crucified. And I think that's very well put, and maybe the best answer I've seen as to why Jesus quotes this psalm in the way he does. It is a genuine cry of despair, but equally, it speaks of God's sovereignty, the Lord enthroned. And so it's in the divine warrior's suffering that he is going to be glorified, enthroned, defeat death, all of those things. And then we have the loud cry. Jesus breathes his last. The curtain of the temple is torn in two. And then we have the centurion confess, truly this man was the Son of God. And so far we had seen demons make that acknowledgement, but here for the first time we have a human. And then we have Jesus buried, and then into chapter 16. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. Let's pick up with Dempsey here. He says, overlooked by Rudman and others, for example, is the connection between the rending of the curtain and the allusion to the combat with death in Isaiah 25, 7-8. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. If this is what lies behind Mark's torn curtain, then the shroud or sheet is not so much the symbolic cosmos thrown into total chaos by the death of Jesus, but a negative element that blocks God's intimacy and connection with his people, one which Jesus' death abolishes. It is precisely at the moment of his death, then, that Jesus is victorious. The shroud is torn and God has swallowed death. Given the fundamental paradox of Jesus' crucifixion as discussed at the outset, his victory in defeat, his death which brings life, we may not need to choose between these two seemingly contradictory interpretations. It is only after Jesus' deposition and burial in the final lines of the gospel that we find the climactic assurance of Jesus' total victory over death. There we read how the women who had been at the crucifixion set out to anoint Jesus' dead body. Mark notes that the time was early morning when the sun had risen, a detail appreciated by Joel Marcus, who perceptively posits that the ascent of the sun at Jesus' resurrection reverses the darkness at his crucifixion. The ascendancy of chaos has ended.